my vegan clients just cannot get pregnant or cannot sustain a pregnancy. Vegans will say that their protein intake is adequate, but when their standard is the current RDA, which is inadequate, it's not enough.
That's like the OG birth control pill right there.
There you go. I mean, we see it in our modern times. You have women who undereat, and one of the first functions of your body that gets turned off is ovulation. Is it actually realistic? 1 in 6 couples facing infertility, every 2% increase in trans fat consumption was linked to a 73% greater risk of ovulatory infertility.
Lily Nichols is a registered dietitian, certified diabetes educator, researcher, and best-selling author. Lily's clinical expertise and extensive background in prenatal nutrition have made her a highly sought-after consultant and speaker in the field. She's the author of 3 best-selling books, including her first book, Real Food for Gestational Diabetes. Her second book, Real Food for Pregnancy, is the most comprehensive text on prenatal nutrition to date. Since its publication, it remains the #1 best-selling book on prenatal nutrition. And her most recent book, Real Food for Fertility. In addition to her books, Lily is founder of the Institute for Prenatal Nutrition, where she mentors other practitioners on perinatal nutrition, and is the co-founder of Women's Health Nutrition Academy, which offers individual webinars on a variety of women's health topics.
Infertility rates are on the rise, right? We have approximately 1 in 6 couples facing infertility. There's a lot of delays in conception that couples are facing. Sometimes there's, a more serious underlying health issue. Other times it can just be, non-optimized lifestyle, nutrition, lifestyle choices, right? But we're at a time point in our history where people are actually having to think a little more about their fertility versus just like, oh, it just happened and here we are. So there's a lot of factors that go into this. Like I mentioned, the food nutrition component, our lifestyle is kind of a mismatch to optimal fertility. We're not living by circadian rhythms. We're highly stressed. We're not as active, or we have some individuals who are extremely active but not fueling adequately. We have exposure to toxins, all sorts of things in our environment that are affecting fertility. Not to mention a lot of couples are waiting a lot later to have babies than we did, ancestrally, which can also play a role. So I started this, and my first 2 books are on the pregnancy side of things. But I was like, wow, we really have a lot more work to do. There's a lot more that we need to do to optimize people's health, not just to get pregnant, but to have also a healthier pregnancy as a whole and a healthier baby. And a lot of those choices really circle back to preconception choices that both partners need to incorporate well in advance of pregnancy.
Right. And so you were talking about all the different factors that kind of go into fertility. And I think you kind of mentioned a lot of people just kind of go into this maybe thinking that just taking a prenatal and not really necessarily thinking about how nutrition can impact that, how their fertility chances. And in your latest book, Real Food for Fertility, you really lay out, I love the approach you take. You lay out the science, and a lot of it was shocking to me. And I've been in this space a little while, and the stats that you share were truly shocking, which we'll dive into. But you also have this fundamental and very relatable approach talking about real food and what humans have been doing for a very long time. And you also talk about all the other lifestyle components, the toxins, the sleep, the stress in here, and an incredible book. And that's something that you alluded to, is that food can make such an impact, not just when you become pregnant and throughout pregnancy, but months, maybe even years, and maybe even generations before you become pregnant. Can you talk a little bit about the importance of nutrients and eating whole foods the months leading up to conception?
Yeah, it depends how long you want to rewind the clock, because arguably we're still benefiting, or maybe not benefiting much, from the choices that our parents or our grandparents or our great-grandparents made in prior generations. There's this epigenetic effect where these exposures over time can impact the development of the next generation and how their genetics are expressed and all of that. If we take it from like the shortest time span, just thinking of like us, our choices now and our future children, we're looking at what is our metabolic health like currently, preconception, because that impacts the quality of our egg and sperm. and our various metabolic health markers, such as our blood sugar and insulin levels being a really big one, but there are many others, levels of inflammation, things like that, levels of micronutrients, that can actually impact the quality of the egg and sperm, the likelihood that fertilization will take place, that early embryogenesis will work out well, implantation, the development of the placenta, like all future coming stages will all kind of work as designed without issue. So when we think about what are the greatest impacts for egg and sperm quality, with egg quality, you technically have to go back about 220 days to the development of the ovarian follicle before it is even developed to the point that it could be ovulated as a fully developed human egg cell. Usually, I mean, that's a hard pill to swallow for people because that's like 7 to 8 months. I will say in the final 3 months or so prior to ovulation, that's when your nutrition and lifestyle choices have the biggest impact. And then for sperm quality, we're looking at, I can't remember the exact number of days, but it's over 70 days. So same kind of time frame, about 3 months or so pre-conception. That's when your lifestyle choices make the biggest impact.
You mentioned, I mean, in the book, you mentioned that women have this, they're born with all their eggs at birth. And then we might have this belief that it's out of our control. The quality of our eggs are out of our control. But that's not the case because, as you're mentioning, 200 and some days, 20 days before conception really makes a big difference in what you eat and the quality of foods that we're eating. And then you go on in the book to lay out not just the science, but cultures that have been doing this for millennia. I mean, as long as humans have really existed, cultures have been prioritizing certain lifestyles and certain foods. And all across the globe, they've been prioritizing the same types of foods. They didn't know each other. They didn't have social media. They didn't know what each culture was doing. So what were some of these cultures doing, and what were some of these foods that these cultures were prioritizing months to years, and maybe even in some cases they were waiting for specific times of the year to become pregnant?
Yeah, it's pretty interesting when you dive into the research on this, which we did when we were writing this book. A lot of our modern concerns about fertility were actually different in times past. Yes, there was the focus on optimization when the time was right, but there was also a withholding of certain foods from couples during times when it was not optimal for them to have a baby. So you would withhold specifically like animal foods and fatty foods, like high calorie foods during certain times to prevent new members being added to your community at a certain time.
That's like the OG birth control pill right there.
There you go. I mean, we see it in our modern times. You have women who undereat, and one of the first functions of your body that gets turned off is ovulation, right? It's like there are not enough resources to grow a baby right now. We're not even going to bother ovulating, right? We're going to take reproduction off the table for a period of time. But on top of this, there were also practices often like before a couple were married, for example, they would put them on a special diet prior to marriage with the assumption that at marriage they would likely have a baby. So it depended on which culture you're looking at. So we have, just off the top of my head, I don't have the book open in front of me, but communities in the South Seas, for example, would maybe prioritize certain types of shellfish in advance of conception. You had the Maasai who would prioritize full fat dairy and more meat for the women and girls and the couple prior to conception. You would even have in some cultures where they would save certain organ meats for the women and their partner prior to marriage or prior to conception. And so there was an understanding that you need kind of the raw materials in order to have reproduction go well. And you have to think, prior to even the last 50 years, we didn't have prenatal vitamin formulas available. So there was no insurance policy with supplements. It really truly was, are they getting the nourishment from their diet or are they not? And they did not have names often for these nutrients. I mean, we didn't identify some of these nutrients until, mid 1900s. And so, there was just sort of an observation, right? It's kind of like, how did these cultures know that certain foods were toxic? Like, well, somebody ate the poison berry or the poison mushroom, and now we know.
Yeah.
Same thing of like, oh, something went wrong with that pregnancy. Oh, that was, consumed. Ooh, this is a problem. Or this pregnancy went well. Oh, good. This person was eating all of this and that. We should eat more of that. A lot of this was through generations of observation, and we're just now kind of piecing together the science as to why those foods may have been prioritized or beneficial. Like, what is their micronutrient makeup? So I try to go through a lot of that different evidence in chapter 3 of Real Food for Fertility, going, food by food, what are the components of these foods and why were they prioritized, and how, in modern times can they benefit our fertility?
Yeah, you do that so very well in this book, and it's so user friendly for anybody that doesn't know much or anything really about fertility. This is such a perfect example and a resource for that. I send it to people all the time that are asking me. And isn't it interesting though, because you just laid out a few foods that these cultures have prioritized for fertility, but we are being told in today's culture to limit these foods, the saturated fat, the cholesterol component to these foods. And I just think it's so interesting that we're also experiencing, a fertility issue epidemic really. And we're also these foods are being demonized, the ones that are directly causing great fertility because of the nutrients. And that's what I want you to touch on a little bit, are what are some of these nutrients in these animal foods that are amazing for fertility? You lay out a list of them, not only the foods, but the science as to what nutrients are in these foods and how they, create good fertility.
Well, I mean, first and foremost, you can start with like the macronutrient side of things, our fat, carbohydrate, and protein. We really need a sufficient amount of protein and fat, especially for supporting fertility. I'm not going to go all anti-carb on you, but like most people really truly are eating a sufficient amount of carbohydrates. Really where you start to see the deficits in hormone production are in individuals who are really restricting their fat and protein intake too much. Of course, anybody who's just under eating as a whole, as I already mentioned, you got problems with hormone production when you're not consuming enough calories. But they've actually done trials where they've put women on low-fat diets, for example. And these trials were done specifically because they were trying to see, could we prevent estrogen-driven breast cancers? And we know fat intake helps support estrogen production. So could this be used for benefit of like preventing cancer and whatnot? Those actually have not, by the way, panned out very well. But they did find, indeed, it did suppress both estrogen and progesterone production. And we're not talking ridiculously low-fat diets. We're actually just talking diets that comply with the current dietary guidelines of approximately less than 30% of your calories coming from fat. That'll tank estrogen and progesterone levels anywhere from like 20 to 50%. So we really have to be getting enough of the raw materials. All our sex steroid hormones are built on a backbone of cholesterol. So if you're not consuming those foods, you're going to have a problem. We only obtain cholesterol from animal foods. Our bodies do have this backup mechanism for producing cholesterol in our bodies, but yet what happens when these people are not eating enough fat? We see the decline in sex hormone levels. So that's a big one that, like, I just want to lay that out from the get-go before I start kind of getting into the weeds on interesting nutrients.
And you mentioned in the book, specific types of fats. It's not just eating more total fat in general. Calories we need, yes, not under eating, but you mentioned specific types of traditional fats and not just going out and eating random fats that you might find in ultra processed foods and on the store shelves.
Right. A lot of it has to do with the quality consumed, right? So yeah, everybody can get like siloed into their little individual, like, oh, we need to just like eat enough of this and not talk about quality. On the other side, you have people only talking about quality or only talking about certain micronutrients that aren't like zooming out enough to see the big picture. So yeah, don't think that I only take a macronutrient focused approach, because you do have to be thinking about the quality. Quality of fats is a big one. Overconsumption of omega-6 fats like you get in the vegetable oils, seed oils, as most people call them these days, or even just in certain animal foods for animals that have been fed a super high amount of seeds in their diet, lots of soy and corn, for example, they actually build up more omega-6 fatty acids in their tissue, and then we're consuming them in that way, right? Those oils are very prone to oxidation, meaning damage, and then they start triggering a cascade of inflammation in our bodies. So we know that excessive consumption of omega-6, for example, will deplete your body's levels of vitamin E. Your vitamin E is trying to fight off that oxidation. Well, guess what? Vitamin E is also really vital to egg and sperm quality. You start to kind of just create more work for your body to try to fight off this inflammation with consumption of those fats. Whereas, animal fats, fats that are high in saturated fat, those don't oxidize easily. They're not actually contributing to inflammation in the same way that these other fats are. So the quality component is definitely important.
I believe you mentioned in your book that, and I was surprised to learn this, that actually eggs, or the cells that make up the eggs, are actually comprised of mostly saturated fat.
Yes, that was a super interesting finding as I was digging into this, because fat is actually one of the hardest macronutrients to research when it comes to fertility, because there's all sorts of conflicting research depending on how the researchers designed the study, how did they measure dietary intake, how long was the trial, is this just like a looking back association sort of a thing, is this a clinical trial, controlled feeding trial? There's all different ways that they could do the research, and then all different ways that they can interpret things to try to shift the findings in a way that's favorable to whoever's doing the research, or to support the current dietary guidelines or whatever it is. So fat is a really tricky one. But I found that fascinating. Yeah, they looked at what is the fatty acid makeup of the human oocyte, the human egg cell, and it was primarily saturated fat. And it's interesting because those cells have a lot of metabolic activity. You have more mitochondria in the human egg cell by far than any other cell type in the human body, because they have to do so much work. I mean, you have to multiply and divide extremely rapidly. I mean, have all the power to differentiate into different cell types and form organ systems. I mean, it's a very complex cell. And how interesting that the majority of the fatty acid makeup is saturated fat. It's like it's trying to protect against oxidation, essentially. It's trying to stabilize itself.
Right. And that's you lay that out perfectly, why it's so important not to fear dietary fats, but also understanding the quality, and these cultures that we just talked about, they would prioritize some of these fats in their diet and for optimal fertility. Can you touch a little bit on protein and its importance, because you laid out a good section in the book, a lot of education surrounding protein and why that's super critical, and how maybe the guidelines, the DRIs are super low for protein, and women are barely even meeting that, and we need to be eating a little bit more protein.
Yeah, so you need protein for so many different functions. You need it for regulating the menstrual cycle. You need it for maintaining just healthy metabolic function, like blood sugar balance, hormone production, maintaining lean body mass, which is so crucial to our metabolic health. Liver detoxification, people talk about toxins all the time, but when you look at what our body actually uses to help detoxify toxic exposures, we need protein to build our detoxification enzymes, right? So that's a really key one that a lot of people don't think about. You also need sufficient protein to maintain a healthy body temperature, which is another big part of fertility. And then, of course, following conception, you're now growing a brand new human being from scratch, which requires a heck of a lot of protein as well. There's a number of ways that our guidelines have got it completely wrong on protein, not just the amounts that are recommended, which is far too low, but the types of protein that are recommended. A lot of people don't realize that our RDA for protein is based on an absolute bare minimum quantity of protein, just enough to survive. It equates to about 10% of calories coming from protein. For an average woman, if you go and calculate out your protein requirements based on those RDA calculators, it's shocking. It's 45, 50, 55, it's a really low amount of protein When you actually look at some of the more current protein research, which now, like, since the RDAs were created, the way in which we can quantify protein requirements has advanced. We used to have these nitrogen balance studies. Now we can actually measure like the oxidation of individual amino acids and all sorts of more advanced ways of looking at protein metabolism. And there's plenty of protein researchers who think we need, a good, like, double in some cases the amount of protein of what the RDAs are set at, or even more than that for athletes, for example. There's also a lot more talk about the protein quality than I certainly had when, I was training as a dietitian. Yeah, we learned the amino acids, but we learned like some are essential, some are not essential. New research has actually revealed that is a misnomer. There's really never been any evidence that certain amino acids are not required. So that opens up a whole can of worms when you talk about people who are not consuming animal foods, because there's certain amino acids that are actually only found in animal foods or only found in sufficient quantities in animal foods. So just because our body has the ability to create some of these amino acids from scratch, is it really optimal for us to not be consuming those whatsoever? And there's a number of examples of some of these amino acids that I cover in the book: creatine, carnitine, taurine, and some others that actually are really helpful for supporting optimal fertility that you're just not going to find in plant food sources either at all, or just not in sufficient concentrations.
Yeah, that's a really nice segue, because before we touch on ultra-processed foods and some of these food ingredients that you might find in ultra-processed foods that might be harming fertility, let's jump in and talk about maybe the challenges of a vegan-vegetarian diet, because you have a whole chapter dedicated to this in your book, and we're talking about the importance of getting in these nutrients found in animal foods. What might be some, with a huge plant-based push in our culture today and the demonization of these animal foods, many women, men and women, because a lot of your discussions in here are focused towards men as well, and I think you cite like half of all cases of fertility issues are attributed to the man in the relationship, which was shocking to me. What are some of the challenges for a vegan-vegetarian approach for fertility?
Yeah, I've before I dive into that, I just want to say I've kind of tried to dance around this conversation in my previous books, right? It's like, why talk about the thing that is not optimal? I'm just going to talk about what is actually optimal. So I don't talk about vegetarian diets at all in my first book. And then in Real Food for Pregnancy, I throw in a little section at the end of the chapter all about foods to emphasize, many of which are animal foods. And then in this book, it was like, okay, we're just doing a full chapter here because these things need to be said and nobody is saying them. So when it comes to a vegan or vegetarian diet, a big consideration is the micronutrient intake and the amino acid intake. So briefly, there's certain micronutrients that may be missing entirely, such as vitamin B12, taurine, carnitine, creatine. There may be some that aren't provided in sufficient concentrations in plant foods. So even though they're there, there's no reasonable way for somebody eating a normal amount of calories to get enough of these nutrients. So choline, selenium, and some other amino acids can fall into that category. There's also some nutrients that just are, again, in the foods but aren't well absorbed. Iron and zinc is a good example. We have some nutrients that are in the food, but it's not in a form that your body can utilize. So the type of omega-3 in plant foods, ALA, there's no feasible way that your body can convert adequate amounts into DHA, for example. You have to be consuming an animal source or an algae-based DHA supplement. Likewise, beta-carotene from plant foods, our body cannot adequately convert into true preformed vitamin A. And then there's also some nutrients that it's possible you could get enough of them from plant foods, but there's found in such in sufficient concentrations in such a limited number of plant foods that most vegetarians and vegans are under consuming them. So vitamin K2, unless you're consuming natto on a regular basis, you're not going to get enough K2. Iodine, unless you're eating seaweed on the regular, you're not going to get enough iodine. So it comes down to is it actually realistic? Then beyond that, you start to look at, okay, what's like the macronutrient makeup of a typical vegetarian or vegan diet? And you see really high intake of carbohydrates, precisely the proportion of the diet coming from carbohydrates that's been associated with infertility in other studies. So most vegetarians are eating 60% or more of their calories from carbs. This drives significant blood sugar dysregulation, which is precisely what I've seen in clinical practice and the majority of vegetarians that I've worked with. You have low amounts of protein. Vegans will say that their protein intake is adequate, but when their standard is the current RDA, which is inadequate, it's not enough, then you're lacking a number of different amino acids. So that adds to its own issue. The protein quality also isn't good enough. So even if you are consuming so-called enough protein, you actually need to be going like even harder on the protein because your body has to do so much metabolic work to try to create these other amino acids that you're not consuming or not absorbing well. And then finally you look at the fat quality, and the majority of fat intake on a vegetarian or vegan diet is from omega-6 sources. So their fatty acid, ratios are completely off. Then on top of that, you look at like caloric intake of a typical vegetarian or vegan, and their calorie intake is often too low. So, when you have a typical vegetarian woman only eating like 1,600 calories a day, no matter what the diet is made up of, that's not enough energy for an adult grown woman to maintain her hormone production. So yeah, there's like a number of different ways you can look at it, but it's just, it often just doesn't work very well unless you put in a really significant amount of effort. And we do outline tips to optimize a vegetarian diet for individuals who want to still embody that dietary choice. We're of the opinion that a vegan diet is inadequate. Consistently, you hear from fertility practitioners. I can't tell you how many fertility practitioners have reached out to me thanking me for this chapter specifically, because they're like, this is what I see in practice. No matter how much we do to optimize, my vegan clients just cannot get pregnant or cannot sustain a pregnancy. And yeah, this is why.
Yeah, I'm so happy that when I got your book, I saw that chapter, because time and time again, you've heard these stories of women, men, they tend to struggle a little bit when they go fully vegan or vegetarian, and it takes maybe some months or a couple years. But your book is titled Real Food for Fertility, and if you're coming from an ultra processed food diet, which we'll talk about, going to eating just more whole foods in general, plants, animals, that's the goal for me, is to help people with that and just eat more whole, real foods. But you outline this beautifully and just lay out some of the struggles that women may be going through if they aren't eating enough calories or protein or some of these nutrients found in animal food. So thank you for putting that in there. It's going to help so many people. On that, let's talk about ultra processed foods and maybe some of these ingredients, because a majority of our diet in American culture today is coming from ultra processed foods. I mean, I believe it was in JAMA, Journal of the American Medical Association, found that over 60% of our adult calories are coming from ultra processed foods, even more for our children under the ages of 18. And so this is a major issue, and there's a lot of ingredients in there that you highlight in your book that may be causing some issues for fertility. Can you talk about those?
Yeah, sure. So our ultra processed foods are, a mess. I mean, as you said, the majority of calories in the American diet is coming from those foods. The majority of added sugar that comes in, 90% of added sugar intake, is in the form of ultra processed foods. It's not people adding like a teaspoon of sugar to their coffee. It's like these sodas and fake fruit punches and ultra processed desserts and whatnot they're really driving this sugar intake. So yeah, there's a number of different ways that this can impact fertility, from the refined carbohydrates and sugars that are in these foods. So like the white flour, refined like starches, and then all the different types of added sugar, the highly processed ones like corn syrup being some of the worst. They really drive blood sugar imbalance. We get this huge blood sugar spike, which then necessitates a huge surge in insulin to try to bring our blood sugar levels down. You have glycation happening within your body, which is driving inflammation. You know, more nutritional resources and more of your body's resources have to be put to use to like quell the inflammation caused by this blood sugar spike and all these damaged proteins from, you know, this high consumption of sugar and refined carbs. Another issue with the ultra-processed foods is they can be a source of artificial sweeteners. And there's a number of artificial sweeteners that have been shown to have a negative effect. Some of them can actually trigger higher blood sugar levels or trigger the surge of insulin. Some of them can also impact the microbiome, and we need a healthy microbiome to support fertility, to support absorption of nutrients, detoxification of different chemicals. There's even certain nutrients that are manufactured in the gut itself. So we definitely need to be careful with the amount and types of artificial sweeteners that are consumed. Another issue is the quality of fat. So oftentimes ultra-processed foods are fried in these seed oils, which we've already talked about, or maybe they're created with trans fats. Of all of the different types of fats, the trans fats are actually the most strongly linked to infertility of any of the other types. There was one study that found that in women of reproductive age, every 2% increase in trans fat consumption was linked to a 73% greater risk of ovulatory infertility. So we really do need to be careful about making sure those are not in our diet. So checking ingredient labels and checking for partially hydrogenated oils. These are less in the food supply these days, because food companies have been pressured to remove them once we had mandatory labeling come in 2006. But sometimes you'll still see them lurking around every once in a while. You'll definitely still see them in imported foods sometimes. So those would be some of the top ones. I would also just add that, you know, ultra-processed foods, the bulk of them are made with some of these ingredients that I'm talking about. But one thing that sets ultra-processed foods apart is that they have a whole bunch of other junk in them as well. You have typically flavorings, colors, you have emulsifiers, things to make the texture, you know, just so-so. Sometimes you have compounds that can change like I don't know, how glossy or shiny it is. There's just all sorts of industrial ingredients that are added in there to make them have a certain taste, texture, mouthfeel, shelf life. Certainly the preservatives are a consideration. So they're just really not things that are offering any sort of micronutrient benefit. They're just offering us, from a macronutrient perspective, refined carbohydrates or sugars and the oils, and then like all these other chemical ingredients that like holds it together. They're not even really food when you think about it.
Yeah, we've touched on this on our platform a few times, but in the 80s, Big Tobacco bought big food companies, Kraft, Nabisco, Heinz, General Mills, and because they realized that their tobacco, their cigarettes were not that healthy, surprise, surprise. And they were really skilled at marketing the cigarettes towards the public, so they bought Big Food, and they became increasingly more addictive over the next couple decades. So in the early 2000s, I mean, that's when you realize like Cheetos and Doritos, and they have scientists that are literally creating these foods to make them highly addictive so you can't put them down. It tricks the pleasure centers inside of our brains, as you were talking about. But you have the science laid out here in your book detailing why this isn't optimal for fertility, pregnancy, and probably even and postpartum and that aspect of pregnancy, fertility as well. And so that we just talked about the vegan, vegetarian kind of approach. And something that really kind of surprised me when I first learned about this, but I mean, when people go plant-based, a lot of these plant-based products are ultra-processed foods. I mean, it's not necessarily just eating whole vegetables. You go up and down the aisles and it'll say maybe plant-based on it, but it's filled with boxes and bags of ultra-processed ingredients, seed oils, refined sugars that you had just mentioned. And just because it says maybe plant-based or natural doesn't necessarily mean it's healthy or health promoting.
Absolutely. Yeah. And a lot of, when you look at, you know, what are the, you know, major calorie contributors on a typical vegetarian diet, and the majority of times it's soy and carbohydrates.
So I want to switch gears slightly, and because we talked about what foods, and you talk about this, I want to make sure I mention this, but at the back of your book, you have a great recipe section and a detailed list, like walk you through every day, every meal. So if people want the tangible, just step-by-step guide on how to implement this, you have it right here in your book, Real Food for Fertility. And what I want to ask, can you get too many of these nutrients from these foods that we're talking about eating that are great for fertility? I mean, first one that comes to mind, maybe vitamin A or choline or iron or zinc or all these nutrients that are good for fertility. Should we be worried about getting these in excess when we start eating more of these whole foods?
So probably out of all of those nutrients, the only one that's a possibility would be vitamin A, but it's pretty tricky to do unless people are taking in a lot of liver, and we could talk more specifically about that if you want. It's pretty unlikely that they're going to be overdoing it. So I mean, first off, our RDA for vitamin A is set at a very, very conservative level. The recommendations we have in the book on liver, I think, are also still on the conservative side, but we recommend about 3 to 6 ounces per week. And that does not, I've done all the calculations on this. If you want the specifics, I have a blog article on liver and organ meat. It's talking mostly from the pregnancy perspective. Same limits, by the way, would hold true in pregnancy, where I walk through like exactly how much vitamin A you'd be getting when consuming that amount of liver per week from either chicken or beef liver. It's not excessive. It's not exceeding the tolerable upper limit by any means. The cases that we have of vitamin A toxicity, and we walk through this in chapter 3 of Real Food for Fertility, are almost exclusively in people supplementing with really high amounts of synthetic vitamin A. You have some rare historical case reports from overconsumption of polar bear liver by Arctic explorers. Polar bear liver should not be equated with liver from beef or chicken or other land animals. It really is truly like quite excessively high in vitamin A, like millions of IUs of vitamin A in a fairly small portion. It's not what you're seeing in vitamin A from land animals down here. But it is a potential possibility. Somebody could go way overboard. And I think nowadays, I never used to think I would have to really talk about quantities so much with people, because it's just such a difficult thing getting people to even be willing to consume organ meats in the first place. But nowadays, with organ meat supplements becoming so common, I do have some people where they're like, oh yeah, I'm eating liver every day, and I'm taking this organ meat supplement, and I'm taking this other organ meat supplement, and I'm taking the top quality prenatal vitamin on the market, which has a good amount of vitamin A in it as well. And sometimes I have to be like, whoa, 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 slow your roll. You don't need to do all of those things. Keep it to the amounts that I'm talking about. If you're taking an organ meat supplement, you want to equate what is that in a raw amount of liver. For me personally, if I'm consuming liver on any given day, I'm not also going to be taking an organ meat supplement. You don't need to. You already took in enough. Anyways, as for the other nutrients that you mentioned, really, really unlikely that people are going to be going way overboard on the nutrients from food sources specifically. Choline, 94% of women are under consuming choline. So that one, no. And there's a pretty good evidence, at least in pregnancy, and also postpartum, that we actually should be aiming for more than double what the current recommended intake is. We have to remember that our guidelines on choline, when they decided it was an essential nutrient, this was 1998. It is the most recent nutrient to be added to our essential nutrients list. And the data that was based on was exclusively in adult men. So our estimates for women are all just it's mathematical estimates. Women are generally smaller than men, therefore they need slightly less, and then they add a little bit extra for pregnancy and lactation. Now we just have the research in women specifically at these different life stages finding, oh, wait a minute, when we give pregnant women twice that amount of choline, more than twice that amount of choline, their kids are smarter. like they have better brain development, not just in toddlerhood. We now have data extending to age 7. And to go further on the choline thing, the tolerable upper limit for choline is quite high. It's like 3,500 milligrams for adults, and that's quite impossible to get from food alone. Absolutely impossible. Like nobody is going to hit that. It's a feat when we even have people hitting, 6, 7, 8, 900,000 milligrams of choline from food. So it's simply not going to happen. Iodine could be a possibility, but only in somebody who's consuming really large quantities of seaweed. So we do see in some Asian countries where seaweed is frequently on the menu, they have higher iodine intakes, definitely. And that kind of brings into question whether our RDA for iodine is truly adequate or not. But nonetheless, unless you're doing a lot of seaweed, it's pretty unlikely you're going to go overboard on that one either.
Yeah, and that's maybe some of the most common questions that I would get and that we get at Ancestral Supplements is, can I eat too much vitamin A if I'm taking, your supplements, or if I'm eating food? And I think for the vast majority of people that do come from eating ultra-processed foods and not really used to eating whole foods, they hear maybe vitamin A is toxic because it's a fat-soluble vitamin. But I think for the vast majority of people, over-consuming these nutrients is a very low concern. I think more people just need to be getting in more of these nutrients, especially for fertility, because you lay out in the book why these are so important for fertility, pregnancy, and postpartum and breastfeeding. And on that note, I have just a couple more questions for you. Prenatals, and because this is a very popular topic, if women are eating, what you're talking about here in your book, the real foods, what is your take on prenatals? Do they need them if their diet is fully optimized, they're doing the organs, they're eating, real food? What is your take on that?
So you're describing maybe like the 1%. Certainly, I mean, if we go back in human history, we didn't always have prenatal vitamins, right? So we did rely fully on food. So in somebody who has no pre-existing health issues, no long-standing nutrient deficiencies, they have never been on hormonal contraceptives because those also deplete nutrients. They are really getting the highest quality food possible, no dietary limitations. They're kind of hitting all marks on the omnivorous spectrum. Then they may be fine without a supplement, but that is a really small proportion of the population. I will even say myself, I've been eating an ancestral style way since I was a teenager. And I did micronutrient testing right before my second pregnancy. And I was surprisingly low in a number of different things. And vitamin A, by the way, was one of them, which is surprising because I was one of those, consuming liver on a fairly regular basis people. And still, like, just the depletion of pregnancy and long-term lactation with my first baby, that probably had depleted me somewhat in my nutrient stores. So I did still supplement. But yeah, somebody who has it fully dialed in, maybe not. They might be okay. You could, out of an abundance of caution, run a micronutrient analysis, work with a well-trained nutritionist or dietitian or functional health practitioner, and just see where you're at, and that would give you the peace of mind either way. But it's a surprisingly small percentage of people who I think are truly hitting the marks. I work with health practitioners in my Institute for Prenatal Nutrition. It's a mentorship program, and one of the things we work on is micronutrient analyses. And most practitioners don't do this, by the way, but like taking a full dietary intake and running a micronutrient analysis, it is surprisingly hard to hit the mark for a number of different nutrients without really dialing it in. It's like, okay, we got like the liver in here, we got like some oysters coming in, we have like multiple eggs, we have this leafy green, we have this citrus fruit, we have, it's hard to hit the marks for everything. Especially on a daily basis. And then you just take, what we're in for in our modern lifestyle of like the toxin exposure, which has to we burn through more micronutrients, trying to detoxify those, and the poor sleep. And then you add hormonal contraceptives, having a baby, lactation, stress, and we see, quite a bit of nutrient depletion. So I'm never going to say no, not whatsoever. That doesn't make sense to me, but I do recommend them for the majority of people. I think a lot of us do need a little extra help of
Yeah.
supplements.
Do you have any good recommendations of ones that you've seen? Because I'm sure there's a wide range of prenatals out there that maybe aren't the best, that don't have the right ratio of nutrients or the right amount of choline in them. Do you have any just particular recommendations?
Yeah, definitely. So I like two brands are the top of my list. Fullwell, that's a dietitian formulated brand, really high quality, and also Seeking Health Optimal Prenatal, also a company run by a health practitioner, really stringent quality control standards. I will say as a caveat for people, as you look into those formulas, they are, it's more than a one a day. In order to get all the nutrients that you need for these, you have to take some capsules because a lot of things take up capsule space. There's a lot of nutrients that are very bulky. Choline is one of them, and a lot of our minerals, like getting enough calcium, magnesium, for example, they take up capsule space. So this is why a lot of prenatals that are just in a one a day format, you're not going to hit the full spectrum of all the things because they can only fit so much into that one capsule. So you will see low amounts of minerals, low amounts of choline in formulas that have a small number of capsules for that reason.
Oh, that's so good. One more question for you. With talking about, dialing in your fertility months, and maybe even we talked about generations before, how this can really impact our health and our chances of becoming fertile. If somebody's just hearing this for the first time and maybe they're pregnant right now and they feel like they missed the boat on doing some of these things, one, is it too late for them? I'm sure you would say no, and maybe to read your other book, Real Food for Pregnancy. But is it too late for them, and what can they do to optimize their lifestyle and diet right now?
Yeah, so funny. I get these sorts of questions so often that I actually wrote a blog article on this, which is, am I too late to benefit from nutrition changes in pregnancy? So I can direct listeners to that as well. My opinion is that, briefly, it's never too late. There's never a bad time to optimize your diet. I mean, I get people contacting me, hey, I'm like 38 weeks. Is there anything I can do? Or even postpartum or in preparation for their next pregnancy. I mean, as moms, we're probably going to be the hardest on ourselves. Oh, I wish I could go back and do this, that, or the other thing. Like, you got to remember, I didn't have Real Food for Pregnancy didn't exist before I had my first baby. Real Food for Fertility didn't exist when I had either of my babies, right? There's a lot that I have learned over the years that, yeah, it would have been great to know about this study on choline before I was pregnant. That study didn't exist, okay? But what's the nice thing about taking a real food approach is that even when you learn new information, like, oh, hey, wow, we need more choline, or, ooh, this is why this vitamin is important, or, oh, I had no idea the role of CoQ10 on this, that, or the other thing. If you are consuming an omnivorous real food diet that's already nutrient dense, the chances that you have already been consuming some of that nutrient or enough of that nutrient are much higher than if you hadn't made any of those changes. There are always going to be like time periods in your baby's development that have kind of a window of opportunity. When we think about congenital birth defects, like a heart defect or a congenital diaphragmatic hernia or a neural tube defect, like those happen typically in the first 8 weeks of pregnancy. There's like a period of time where these cells are differentiating and forming organs and organ systems and different structures in the body, where when you miss that time frame, yeah, like you're too late. That is probably the most serious of like the considerations, which is why, again, when you have the luxury of planning ahead, building your nutrient stores preconception, optimizing your lifestyle choices preconception, will have the greatest benefit. But assuming you've gotten through that early part of pregnancy, maybe you're like halfway through, 3/4 of the way through, there are still steps that you can take to optimize. Some of our studies on nutrients in pregnancy, the intervention period is only during the second and third trimester, or only during the third trimester, or sometimes it's things only during lactation, where it's like boosting the levels of certain nutrients in your breast milk. I think we need to, think of our bodies a little more kindly and a little more from a standpoint of resilience, because heck, a lot of this research didn't exist when when I was in utero, right? And certainly I didn't know all that I know now, even when I had, my kids. And I'm not going to sit around like beating myself up. It's just, I knew what I knew then, and I knew what I know now, and I'm going to take the steps to optimize whenever I can.
Absolutely. I love that you said that. I mean, we need to have a little grace with ourselves because we don't know everything and we're never going to know everything, but we're doing the best that we can do now with all the information that we have. And I love that you said that the research, the evidence, the studies just didn't exist then. But that's why I love the approach that you take, because our ancestors, they didn't have any of this research. They didn't have any studies, yet they did what they intuitively knew was going to help them. And I think that's the importance of just eating a whole foods based diet, because 20 years from now, we're probably going to discover another nutrient that we didn't know about now. But because we were eating a whole food based diet, we were getting that in and it was helping our bodies now. But just because we don't know about it doesn't mean it's, it's not important. So
Exactly.
Thank you for joining us today and talking about your new book, Real Food for Fertility, which is absolutely incredible. Like I said, I recommend it to anybody that asks me anything about fertility or just optimizing, their chances. That's the first resource I always send them. So can you let listeners know where they can find out more about you, grab your book, and just a little bit more about yourself?
Yeah, for sure. So main hub is my website, lilynicholsrdn.com. There's a tab for books up in the menu bar, so you can click on that. That'll give you all the information about Real Food for Fertility, Real Food for Pregnancy, and Real Food for Gestational Diabetes. Over at realfoodforfertility.com, we do have the first chapter available for free. If anybody wants to download that, you have that at your fingertips. That'll give you also like the table of contents, the introduction, the foreword by Dr. Viva Ram, so you can like get a better feel for what it is before buying if you'd like to. We also have an ebook and an audiobook as well. And yeah, over on my my main site, Lily Nichols RDN, is where I have my blog. There's a whole bunch of other freebies available there. So take your pick, do some reading. I've not chosen to like put all my work onto, Substack or some other paywalled place. So all the blog articles on my website are freely available. So use the search bar and you'll find lots and lots of different research-based pieces of information on prenatal, postpartum, fertility, and breastfeeding nutrition.
Love it. Lily Nichols, thank you for joining me today.
Thank you.